So Sean McDowell just posted this debate between some gentleman named John West, who's does not have a background in Bible or New Testament, and he's debating Mike Licona, who of course does, on the topic of biblical inerrancy. Unfortunately, they don't define biblical inerrancy at the outset, which I think is always essential in these conversations. Uh, I got to say that I'm definitely, although I'm not a fan of MAGA Mike Licona's political views, I've been very appreciative of his work in New Testament. John West does not impress me in this debate, I will say that. But what I wanted to do here is just to play John West's opening statement. So Sean McDowell asked John West, why does this matter? The idea of a particular view of biblical inerrancy, why does that matter? Why is that important? John West is going to give his explanation about teaching at an increasingly liberal Seattle Pacific University and why he believes that it's a sort of a bellwether warning for the denigration of the church if you abandon his view of a biblical inerrancy. And it's very interesting, particularly with my book, The Wideness of the Sea, How to Be Evangelical and Gay Affirming, coming out just in the next couple of weeks. So let's listen to what John West has to say, and then I'll just have some quick thoughts on the other side.
I think three things. One is the truth of the content of Christianity itself. If most of what we know, I mean, not everything, but a lot of what we know about God, about Christ, about the plan of redemption comes from the Bible. And so if the Bible is somehow inaccurate or unreliable, or the gospel authors felt free to invent new situations, new sayings of Jesus that he didn't say in history, or even new chronologies, but and felt in service of a larger spiritual point that they thought were true, I think that does raise questions about what we actually know is true about the content of Christianity. I think.
Okay, this is just worth commenting on as a side point. So here, this is this classic inerrantist argument that if there are any errors in the Bible, how do you know that something you believe from the Bible is not one of those errors? The problem here is, first of all, that is not a reason to think there are not errors. That is a reason to think that if there are errors, then you have to be careful not to believe one. So that's the first thing. The second thing, however, is this is just you got to wonder, is this gentleman aware of general human fallibility? That even if the text is without error, we as human interpreters are error laden. We are fallible creatures. I mean, just look how much disagreement there is among Christians on how to interpret the Bible. So even if you had a quote unquote inerrant text, it doesn't mean that we have that we are inerrant interpreters of that text. Second problem there is, of course, we don't have the autographa, which are the original writings that folks like John West claim were inerrant. What we have are imperfect copies. So you can always ask that same question. How do you know that these copies that we have access to do not have some errors that have been introduced? Just as John West wants to circumvent the general error problem by reasserting his doctrine of biblical inerrancy, so people who are concerned by the lack of access to autographa have sometimes tried to leapfrog that by claiming that they do have an inerrant copy of the Bible. Now, probably the most bald case of that is certain King James only churches who claim that the King James is God's one authoritative word for the church today, like the English authoritative translation without error. Kind of, yes, a crazy view, but that is an example of applying the same kind of logic that John West is applying to the Bible generally, and now applying it to the problem of a lack of access to the autographa or the original writings. And then the third thing is translation. The vast majority of us, I assume John West, because he's not a specialist, are dependent upon translations. What that means is that we are dependent upon the fallible, imperfect translation choices of interpreters. So whether you are reading the King James or the ESV, the NIV, the NRSV, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you are always dependent upon the imperfect, fallible translation choices. So you got error at multiple points. So when inerrantists try to claim that the sky falls, if you admit to any errors in the original autographa, of the human authors, they just seem unaware of the fact that you're not even beginning to address the problem of error because there are multiple other failure points before that text ever gets to your reading eyes. Okay, let's hear the rest of what John West has to say.
Two, it raises a question about the very concept of truth. And I would say that some of these ideas, not the ideas that the gospel writers use compositional devices or use things like ordinary paraphrase or ordinary compression, or I mean, that was actually talked about even at the time of Augustine. So I mean, that's not new. It is. I do think that Mike has given a deeper, richer appreciation for that. But when you get into the area of, again, gospel writers feeling free to invent new sayings of Jesus, new situations, new events that didn't occur, I think that really dovetails with a very postmodern view of truth that I think is ultimately destructive. And then finally,
I think that this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. When you talk about it questions the concept of truth, you are now into the field of philosophical debate about truth theories. You're talking about things like the correspondence theory of truth, the deflationary theory of truth, the pragmatic or consensus theory of truth. And you're debating what is the appropriate theory of truth. But of course, nothing that John West has said here with respect to the scholarship of Mike Licona actually has an impact on that level. It underdetermines one's theory of truth. So when John West says this raises questions about the very theory of truth, that's just, I would say, fundamentalist incendiary rhetoric. He's just trying to say, I this is like this is the perlocutionary effect of his speech act. In other words, this is actually what he's doing with his language. He's simply flagging to people, I think Mike Licona's views are very dangerous. And so I don't like them. So I'm going to talk about them as challenging the very concept of truth as we understand it. But in fact, it doesn't do that at all. So it's a very bad sign that anything else you're going to get from John West is probably not going to be very reliable. But now we come to the third point, and this is the one that I really wanted to focus on with respect to my forthcoming book. John West is going to argue here for a kind of slippery slope. If you admit that there are errors in the text, that will put you on the slippery slope to an intolerable conclusion. What do you expect that conclusion is going to be? Let's see.
at a personal level, I think, depending on how far you take it, I don't think it's really sustainable. And this, you mentioned the time I spent at Seattle Pacific, and I do admit this colors me. So I was there for 12 years. I had tenure, and then I've watched what has happened since I went there. And I'll be honest, when I got there, the theology and Bible faculty, none of them accepted historic inerrancy, but they all said, it didn't matter because we do think that the Bible is authoritative, and we're going to teach that. And so because it's.
I'm sorry. I got to interject. I don't recall here what specialist, what John West is a specialist in, if it's business or law or something else. But I've seen this dynamic of a fundamentalist in some other field of expertise becoming outraged at what Christian academics are doing within their respective fields of expertise. And if you watch the rest of this debate, I get the frustration that Mike Licona has for this guy, thinking from his layperson's perspective that he is now equipped to critique the biblical scholars. And I can understand why the biblical studies department at Seattle Pacific probably rolled their eyes when they saw this guy coming down the hallway.
It was in service of higher spiritual truths, even though the exact things that the Bible said might not be accurate, or they invented things, but it was still authoritative. And that's what they said. But then I saw how this impacted students, how it often destroyed or really wrecked some of their faith. And then I saw on the faculty who said this, that over time.
Okay, brief interjection here. This is really irritating. So this guy will say, I saw how questioning the doctrine of inerrancy wrecked the faith of students. Well, you didn't. How intimately are you familiar with the details of the specific religious journeys of particular students to know that it was the doctrine of inerrancy that quote unquote wrecked their faith? You have no clue. But what people like John West do is they just make sweeping claims about what they've observed as being the loss of faith in an individual, which of course itself may be a highly contentious notion. Maybe that individual has a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of faith that you simply don't like. But the second thing is, even if they did quote unquote wreck their faith, to assume that you know the catalyst for that. Um, sorry, my dog is growling right now. I think he doesn't like John West. Timbit, do you like John West? No, he doesn't like John West. Okay. I get it, buddy. I get it. Anyway, so the assumption that you know what caused their shipwreck of faith, as it were, and that it was the doctrine of inerrancy, maybe actually what caused their loss of faith was being raised for 18 years in a fundamentalist household and coming to grapple with some of the truths about what the Bible is and what its nature is, realizing that you were lied to or misled for 18 years, and that is what in fact instigated the crisis of faith, so that you're just shooting the messenger, the Bible prof who was doing their due diligence in actually educating this student because they've been shortchanged for 18 years of their life. So always call out people like John West when they invoke what they allege are the implications of a particular doctrine and show that they actually don't have the information or evidence to make those kinds of sweeping judgments. Now, finally, we are going to come to the thing that I really wanted to talk about, which is what he believes is the ultimate consequence of all of this questioning of his notion of biblical inerrancy.
Any new wind of doctrine that came, they were, because once they placed themselves in judge over scripture and, well, is this really authentic, or we need to go behind it to really understand it, then rather than being a student or being bound by scripture, they got further and further afield, and then they hired people who got further and further afield. And then after I left, you can see where this really went, is when just a couple of years ago, and this was part of the impetus while I was writing the book, where actually had a vote of the faculty where over 70% basically rejected the biblical idea of marriage between one man and one woman. Over 70.
No, no. Look at Sean McDowell. That's not good. So what John West is saying here uh, is this is a slippery slope, right? Once you begin to question inerrancy, you get more and more liberal. You are affected by every wind of doctrine, as he would have it. You placed yourself over the text. Of course, all of this is nonsense. You're not. Every one of us is an interpreter of the text. So is John West. He's interpreting it from his particular fundamentalist layperson's background. The academics at Seattle Pacific University have their own backgrounds by which they are questioning particular interpretations and applications of the text. We're all doing that. It's not like one group has placed themselves over and above the text. We're all critically engaging with the text from various different traditions, experiences, and just general data sets. And John West doesn't like the data set of the academics at Seattle Pacific University who specialize in Bible. But then it's like the ultimate worst thing that could happen is to accept gay marriage. Um, and so that's, in fact, he says here, that was a major catalyst for him even writing this book. And I'm not familiar with his book, but I guess it's a book warning about the encroaching questioning of inerrancy from scholars like Mike Licona. And the main catalyst for that here is he is afraid that this will lead to questioning of the quote unquote biblical doctrine of marriage. So this is a great example of how we continue to be on, well, as I'm going to point out in The Wideness of the Sea, my forthcoming book, evangelicalism is on the cusp of a shift and has been so for about 20 years now. And the shift is to becoming affirming inclusive. And what that means is not necessarily that you as an individual are affirming of gay marriage and same-sex relationships, but that you are affirming of that as a stance which is consistent with evangelical identity, just like you could be an Arminian but believe that Calvinism is consistent with evangelical identity, or more recently, you could be old earth creationist but come to believe that through organizations like Biologos that evolutionary creation or theistic evolution is consistent with evangelical identity. Evangelicalism is shifting now. It is becoming inclusive. affirming inclusive, I should say. And people like John West don't like that. They're terrified by it. They are angered by it. And in his case, as a result, he wrote a book defending his particular notion of biblical inerrancy to attack it. So there's a long journey ahead. It's going to be painful, but I think it is also important as evangelicalism continues to seek the divine will and guidance on these important issues.